Hi everyone. Hi Aya. Hi Hilina. We are here today for this interview of 30 Minutes With. 30 Minutes With is a series with African leaders, activists, policymakers discussing current African affairs. So today we are going to discuss youth and governance. How do you feel?
Great.
Great. Yeah. So, can you please introduce yourself, Aya?
My name is Aya and I'm from Tunisia and I am pursuing my master's in African Studies here at SOAS.
My name is Hilina, I'm from Ethiopia and I'm doing my master's in LLM Law and Gender here at SOAS.
So can you tell us more about yourself? I guess you are not only students. What do you do?
I consider myself a women's rights activist back home. I do advocacy and campaigning for women's rights, mainly in higher educational institutions and the institution that I was part of. So I'm a women's rights advocate, a full-time feminist, with no ifs and buts.
Great.
I would say I'm feminist and Pan-African, full-time. So I work a lot on with youth movements and African youth around the continent and diaspora. And yeah, I left a lot of work back home, so can't wait to go back and continue.
So let's discuss governance now. How would you define the concept of governance?
Well, I mean, governance, just for me, in a short definition, is the delivery of public goods. But I think public goods have different indicators. So it's a range of things from economic to social to political goods. And for example, in Mo Ibrahim Index, it's 93 indicators. If I would talk about Tunisia, and there are of course some indicators that are more important for others, depends on the country. But there should be a balance of everything. You can't prioritize education over health or things like that. But I think for Tunisia in particular, we have had a revolution 2010-2011. And I think the motivation behind that revolution is the discontent with the failure of the state to deliver certain public goods, which wouldn't be related to education or public health or infrastructure, but would be related to the rule of law, to justice, to basically economic goods, and also to the participation and transparency.
I think in general what I would add is I think governance is also very much related to service, like she mentioned, but it's also about at the bottom level. I think that's what's ignored internationally and what's ignored in many governments, especially within the context of Africa, that we tend to overlook what's in trade unions and informal spaces. So governance for me is very much about informal spaces and trying to facilitate service within the informal space and trying to incorporate that within the general national structure as well. So Ethiopian government, there are things that I'm not really happy about as a citizen. I think not everyone is getting their way, in any country of the world. But the thing is, I really focus on myself and for my contribution, what I can do within the governance sphere. And for me, like I said, it's a reflection of the informal space. It's within the NGO, trade unions, and those are the things that I see as governance, as within the governance framework, and that I emphasize on. And I wish that specifically governments in Africa can deliver better, and they can do much better and not let us down constantly. And I want to see change in many aspects, like education, health, and specifically for women. Because at the end of the day, although we don't really make much of an effort within the policy decision making, not because we don't want to, but because we're not given that space, but at the end we're disproportionately affected by whatever is coming out of it. And I think that's governance.
I think it's one of the indicators is actually participation in government. And that participation can be actually participation in the government as someone who is in the parliament or someone who is in the institutions, or participate in partnership with civil society, as you say, trade unions, groups, women groups, feminist groups, youth movements, and so on. I think this is where we're heading towards in Africa, that we're focusing a lot on that partnership, because I know we're going to talk about young people, but I already talk about young people. I can't wait.
Great. It's a great transition.
But I think, for example, we talk about young people exclusion from decision making. But the exclusion is not only because young people are not like running for office or elected into those positions, but they are excluded as partners. You know, in civil society, if you have an NGO and you want to partner with the Ministry of Education to actually reform the education sector, you're excluded because that's the understanding of governments, that it's the government job. It is the government job, but it should be with engagement of the citizen. The citizen should feel that I am actually working towards making the government deliver whatever services.
And I totally agree with you on that. When we come, for example, to talk to Senegal, it's exactly what is happening. The youth is engaged in civil society organizations and so on, but do you think there is enough space within civil society for the youth? Is it a government problem, or is it a problem of older or patriarchal, for both for women and for youth? Do you think those who are already there are making space for the youth to strive and to participate?
Well, if we talk about Senegal, I mean, the Yunamar movement and the whole like protest you had and how you change and peacefully the president, I think it's a proof that young people are not, because of the exclusion, young people now are not waiting for either the government or the civil society to tell them what to do. So they can just organize in different forms of activism and they can raise their voices. And I think that's what happened in Senegal, that what happens in Tunisia, that what happens in Burkina and in South Africa just a few months ago, protesting for their rights of zero fees in schools. So that might look like it's the job of someone else, and that's why they're excluding young people from that discussion. But it's the job of everybody. What's the state? What's the state? The state is people, you know? The state is people. They're people who are in leadership positions, that they should be held accountable, and they're people who are citizens and receiving those services. So it's a mutual relationship. You can't just say, oh, this is a job of whoever. And young people, I think there is a growing consciousness, and political consciousness especially, that we are not going to sit here and wait for the government to do things. Because actually it's not the government job to provide jobs. It's the government job to provide conditions for investment. And then we make young people thrive as entrepreneurs and as drivers of whatever sector they want to work in. So this kind of conscious understanding that is growing is important, I think.
And what do you think is leading to this conscious understanding?
I want to start with transition. I think transition is a very important word in the continent of Africa, and we feel very uncomfortable with transition, giving it to whoever is next in line. And I think people feel very comfortable with power once they're in it. And I don't know what it is, but people promise to change it, and then they go in and they don't really change it. So transition is a very important key factor in political participation, being able to hand it out to the next generation, but also grooming the next generation to be part of it, to be doing well at it as well. And we lack at both. We don't want to mentor young people because you don't get that much of mentorship that's formalized or in an informal way within our communities, because nobody expects us to rise to the task, and it's never an issue. So it's whether it's with age or any sort of advocacy. And I was at this conference a few months back, and women who were in power at that, they were doing really well for other women, but they were stuck in that space and that mentality that was way outdated, and they didn't really want to share the space, and they were telling us maybe you need experience, and I don't know what it is with experience, but
if they don't give you the chance
to have experience right now, then you're never going to have the experience to be what they are today. So that contradicts.
You actually just reminded me, I was at the Heads of State Summit in Ethiopia few months ago, and the AUC chair, the African Union Commission chair, Dr. Zuma, said we were in the intergeneration dialogue, and we presented recommendations, and then it was her to give the speech, and then the first thing she said is, the first question was asked to her is why you don't support youth movement as you support women movements, because she's a great advocate of women's rights and so on. And so her answer was, women are organized. And then she asked us, what are your responsibilities? You know, you're asking us of these all recommendation and commitment, what are your responsibilities? And I think the elder generation in general needs to understand that there is a difference between women movements and youth movements. And I think us being part of both are in a good position to understand that. Because women movements have one goal, the fight of patriarchy system. And destroying the patriarchy system is solving our issues. It's one goal, gender equality. And it's throughout the generation have been reinforced from a generation to another. So it's actually building up. So when we are in women movement, we don't feel we're marginalized as young people as much as we feel as we are like in a generational gap. It's all elder women, young women, they all have same values of feminism or goals. We argue more on ideologies rather than the goal. But in youth movement, you have a statehood of youth that you are so marginalized and excluded from decision making. And once you're out of that like period, you're now taken seriously, have a career options, have leadership position, whatever. But then at that state of youth, you don't have anything. And this is the problem in Africa. We're more than 50% of the continent, but most of the young people are marginalized. And then moving from one generation to another, you have a totally different vision. It's not the same vision of the elder generation as my vision as the next generation. And I think that's my frustration with many of the elder generation, that first listening, of course, but I think mainly second is that many of them, they don't understand that we have our own way of organizing and we have our own vision, and it's fine if it's not the same as
long
how
as
they saw it in like, I don't know, 4 or 5 decades or centuries ago. And this needs to be clear, because arguing that women movements are organized and youth movements are not.
And even creating that dichotomy between youth and women movement, I think it's not very constructive. And even what you were saying, the way of organizing, I did a study on Senegal, on women. There is a book, Women's Group, Women's Social Movement, written by Ndeye Sokhna Gueye in 2012. And she was comparing Senegal, Mali, and Gambia and Guinea-Bissau. And what she found was that women's movement, how they organize, is radically different, for example, from how men in general organize. We are less outspoken, we are less violent, we tend to be less to express things that have to do with the public sphere rather than the private sphere. In Senegal, we don't talk about homosexuality and so on. So I think it's not contradictory what youth movement are trying to do and women movement are trying to do. And we need more to build synergies between the two rather than saying this is different and this is not. And even women's movement, they are not as static as we might think they are, because the issue of intersectionality has been recognized. So if you are a woman, you need to recognize all other aspects in which you are disempowered or whatever, and try to work on that or engage, organize on that. And regarding youth movement activism, how do you think, to talk about youth and governance, how do you think youth movement today are reclaiming their rightful place in this tripartite partnership you were talking about between civil society, government, and private sector? There is much emphasis on private sector right now. How about the civil sector?
I think in the case of Ethiopia, I would say, for example, within the intersectionalities, I think youth work within the intersectionalities that are given to them as women, as coming from a certain ethnic group, and all those intersectionalities make them really attach their true emotions and feelings to push whatever agenda that they have. And it's not like you said, there are so many intersectionalities that we face. For example, I'm an African youth. There is the youth part, the African part, coming from the South, not being part of a state because I'm a youth and I'm a woman as well. So all that layers of oppression will be there. But for me to have that push, I think one of them need to kick really hard for me to feel it, whether it's the ethnic one or whether it's in relation to the economic part, whatever sphere you're really oppressed, and then you start feeling like a youth, you're like an actual youth, you'll be like, oh yeah, I'm a young person, I have a stake in this, I have to participate. But unless you have that push, that kick, I don't think all of them will work for you. I just think you need to have that one fire that's like really hard, and then you'll be like, okay.
So let's go a bit personal. As a person is political,
How
did that kick happen for you?
Older people. So I think for both, what we have in common is that we are not taught to fail, and we don't even have the chance to fail, to learn from our failures, and that is really sad. I think that's one thing.
We have a lot of similarities, actually. We have a lot of similarities, yeah.
There's that.
What I would, back to your question, I think there is also this myth that young people don't want to engage in politics. but I think it's also the lack of understanding of what this generation is trying to achieve. And I think what happens in the past 5 years in Africa tried to show, but still many people don't understand, that young people want to do change, but in a different way, from traditional politics or partisan politics or whatever liberal democracy, whatever form you have established post-colonial Africa on, and you want to continue the same in 2015, and young people are telling you in 2011, no, this is not what we mean by politics. This is not what we understand by politics. So I think many people who say, or now like many people try to push for youth leadership programs and young people run for office, young people be in decision making, whatever. But you need to understand that young people, when they, you know, don't, like boycott the ballot box or it's a political statement. And what they're saying is that we have our own way of organizing. And the example in Tunisia is that after, you know, the youth movement, after we ousted the Ben Ali and so on, we have decided to build a strong civil society. And then the Nobel Peace Prize was given to civil society. It was not given to any politicians because no politician could save the country. It was the civil society. Everybody organized themselves into lobbying groups, into media collectives, into watchdogs of the government. And then you build a rising civil society and you work a lot with grassroots and you work with access of information to the ordinary people. And that's what made Tunisia, I mean, if we're gonna measure compared to the region, go forward in the democratic transition.
And even I think it was a sign. Like,
and then the results...
Receiving that Nobel Prize was a sign of encouragement, or what really matters.
The importance of civil
within
society.
The frame that are theirs, not trying to fit or trying to... I totally agree with...
Mold themselves into the already existing organization.
Yeah. Exactly. I think we need to like move away from like, oh, young people, they are not doing this, and this is the right thing for them to do. Because even like Western organizations, when they come to Africa, all they push for is a certain agenda. Young people should be in leadership position. Okay, what kind of leadership position we want to be in? Do I want to be a president? Do I want to be a parliamentarian? Or do I want to be a head of a coalition? Or do I want to be, you know, building a network and supporting women in rural areas or whatever, you know? So I need the understanding of leadership of young people, political, because it doesn't mean that I have a network or I have an organization that I'm not political or I'm not pushing for political change. So whoever comes in and say youth leadership and start to talk about us, they need to understand first, what do we mean by leadership and what kind of leadership we want to strive for.
And understand also that the youth is not homogeneous, like it's not one single strand.
Another myth.
Yes, another myth. And it was exactly the case in Senegal when Y'en a marre, there were a lot of let's say clashes between Y'en a marre and the Mouvement M23, because Mouvement M23, obviously it was all coalitions of opposition groups, syndicate unions, and Y'en a marre was also part of it. But at most of the time they would just break, or when we organize, even the way that we would organize, you would come to meetings, Y'en a marre would say, we will go to this direction, the old traditional politician leaders will say, we will do this. So you see that, and even now, after all that we reclaimed happened, the opposition were there asking, so now what do you want? As if Y'en a marre did what it did because it was expecting to be given some place in the government or so on. Y'en a marre refused and said, we are there and we are going to stay and remain a watchdog. We are watching you. And so they are trying to... Another thing that I wanted to ask you about, talking about youth and governance and civil society, the youth as a counter power, if you may say so, is how do you feel, how do you think you are interacting with your government? Do you think your government is trying to recuperate what you are doing or trying to corrupt or undermine your actions in some way when they label you as unorganized? Is it a way to discredit you? Is it a way, if they cannot recuperate you, is it a way to discredit you? What are the interactions between government, youth movement, in particular, and civil society in general? How do you feel about it?
That's a short conversation for me. That's a very short conversation in the context of Ethiopia. I mean, I can say none.
None.
Because not much is like there for us to go in and push for things and interaction. We try. It's not that we don't try. We try. I personally try, given with, within the educational institution and the Ministry of Education maybe, but it's not that direct. It's not that embraced. It's not that loved. I don't think it's respected as well. And it's not respected because of many, many reasons. I can recite them and we can have a long discussion about that, but it's not respected. So the interaction is very much limited and how it's going to go. And so I already know what to expect. I already know what I will get. So it's an already informed decision. I'm not surprised. I've never been. So it's a very limited one. That's a very short conversation.
I mean, for Tunisia, of course, it's a totally different context because I can't talk about Tunisia for the last 2 decades or something. It has to do with the revolution and things before and things after. And I think any new governments try to sometimes use this card of involving young people, engaging young people. These words have become buzzwords sometimes, even in the African Union. But sometimes when we did the revolution and then the youth movement wanted to build a youth assembly to decide the future of the country. At some point we felt everything was hijacked and then other forces came in to, fill in the vacuum. And they're like, okay, you did your job, you kicked out the dictator, now let us rule the country. But then I think that's one of the ways why we as youth movement, okay, what's going on? And then we started to organize. Because, as you know, youth movements are very decentralized. And sometimes you can lose momentum. So you need to be organized in certain structures. But then I think because we changed the government many times for the past 5 years, and now we had elections, the last one in 2014. So any new government is receptive, not only for youth, but in general for civil society to partner. Because we are now all together building the country. And the kind of politics in Tunisia is compromise, coalition politics style. So it's about national unity, and that worked for us since the revolution to temper the polarization between secularists and Islamists. So that worked, but also it created this kind of receptive openness to partnership with civil society, with labor unions, with everybody. And I think that's an opportunity. That's why when I talk about revolution, I think it's a challenge and opportunity. Even though we feel sometimes, okay, we were hijacked in certain things, okay, we need to be very careful and watchdogs of the freedoms that we're acquiring and so on. But I think it's also an opportunity for the engagement of young people. It's an opportunity to claim that space, to be in that leadership position. It's an opportunity to say, now we're building the national strategy. Okay, this is what we see as national strategy. And I think this generation is the most innovative generation in the history of, I think, human history, because many of this generation are digital natives or internet natives. So it's not option for them anymore. They need us because young people today are very innovative. They are the ones who will bring those ideas to the government. They are the ones who will bring a new kind of investment, new kind of economy. You're talking about the private sector. Look at the entrepreneurs in Africa. The new kind of ideas of entrepreneurship and enterprises that are rising are very innovative. And if you look at the age, it's average, 30, 28 years old. So I don't think, on the one hand, I think, yes, as young people, we need to push for that. But on the other hand, I think there is no option anymore. And even though there is this resistance of young people are welcome to do whatever they want, but then at the implementation, we are not part of it. But it slowly becomes you have no option. We're over 50% again of this country. You have no option. I mean, half a century, Africans will be half of the world, it's crazy. We're growing younger and younger with the youngest in the world. So at some point, it's no option. If you have 60% of your population young people, how you cannot involve them in enterprise and all the sectors in education? How you cannot? It's 60% of your population. You can't ignore it.
So let's talk about systemic issues. The youth is doing very well in Africa, in all our countries. I can see that we are trying to push forward and put down boundaries that were holding us. But what do you think of other challenges that we face? Whether it's brain drain, people taking, in Senegal we have it, people taking the boat to leave. Is it disenchantment? What do you think of the main challenges that we face, whether as a youth, as a young woman, all the sexist discrimination and so on? What is your reaction to that, and how do you fight against it every day?
I think we have many challenges.
Yeah.
Yeah, do you have a list I can write?
As any society, actually.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. As any society, it relates to what we are economically within the world, how we're in that structure of the West and the South. There is that. And there is another level of marginalization as well within the states. And then, again, intersectional elements will play in. So for us, the challenge comes from what we have, access to things and access to opportunities. Are we given those on the basis of what, really? Because most societies prefer to give it to one sector of it and ignore the other section of it. And I think that's one problem that we have. In general, in particular, for example, for a woman with movement, again, culture is one thing. And I don't want to generalize by saying culture, because there are so many beautiful, positive cultures, but the application of culture, who applies it, the upper hand in everything. So whoever gets to tell the first story, gets to do the first interpretation, will do it for us, on behalf of women, on behalf of young people. And then we'll be at the receiving end. And the result will be in mess, because it's not a good interpretation that fits the contextual interest that we have at the moment. And that's really like a huge challenge. People use religion, culture to put you down, and that's not true. Religions and cultures embrace diversity if we make them embrace diversity, because they're not static. Everything moves around. We need to find a way to shift and go with the flow. But for us, we're very stuck in one way, and that's the biggest laydown for me, structurally speaking. And I want us to have an open environment like this, for example. We don't discuss things. You don't have that platform for you, so we can discuss and talk about and challenge each other. Because there are, decentralization is one factor. We all have our own issues, and we need to have a unity to come together and to say, these are our problems, and we have a common enemy in all of it. Because for us, our goal is to have an equal opportunity with the rest of the world, and to be on an equal term. And having the capacity but not being there is really, really difficult thing to accept. Personally, that's what I feel very uncomfortable with. So we have so many challenges, but first you can add.
Yeah. I think there are two ways to look at it. Challenges within each community's context or country, and challenges within Africa. And I always look at things as Pan-African. I think if I would look at African youth as around the continent, and bearing in mind, as you said, the non-homogenization of young people because they're diverse, the biggest challenges facing young people in Africa, if I look at it from a continent perspective, Pan-African perspective, is first economic rights, because we're still talking about unemployment, and that's not an exception to Tunisia or an exception to Uganda or an exception to any country. Young people around the continent are facing economic issues, and we need to face that, and we need to start seriously having solution for this and providing solution for this. And as I said, like the government, maybe not the government job to provide jobs, but it's to provide conditions. And the enabling environment is also linked to security issues. And that goes to the second challenge. I think we're facing a huge challenge of security. Not only, we cannot talk about security issues in our inside our borders. It's now a network of transnational movements of people and arms, and that should be, African government should take that seriously, especially that these networks of extremism are targeting young people. So many people think that fundamentalism is about religious fundamentalism, but actually it's about social injustice towards young people. Young people don't go to these groups because to find, of course part of it is religious, but it's not all about being extremist. It's also because there is no alternative in society, and if you provide me another alternative where you can give me representation, where I can have a say, where I can have a job, when I can have money, technology, everything. Actually, they're doing a research on the Islamic State, and they say that the Islamic State has more than 80 citizenships and has no visa restriction, and speak in more than 10 languages, and the average age is 30. So if I go to another state that has the average age as 30, it will be better than being in my state, and average age is 80 in leadership, So But it's really, going back, it's an economic, right? It's being able to have a job, and as a young person, being able to sustain yourself. And that doesn't exist within the states, the model of nation state that we have. And that's why young people go to radicalization. So I think Africans need to take that seriously, because we're losing resources. Young people are human resources in Africa. If you are losing those young people into radicalization, then what are your labor force left with, you know? In Tunisia, it's very funny that we have more than 3,000 young people actually in Syria fighting with ISIS. And it's top of the list. It's like the major group. So, funny enough, those same young people come from the country that did the revolution and that is striving for social change and that succeeded to do the democratic transition. So that also need to reflect to ourselves, okay, what are the young people opportunities here in Tunisia and what they are offered, and are they happy with this transition? The third, I think, free movement, which I talked about, like transnational solidarity. I think transnational solidarity is very important for young people to not only build these movements inside our countries, but also to inspire other movements. We already did. We did with Senegal when, you know, they were holding placards of Blaise Dégage. We did with Burkina, you know, South Africa, you know, all around the continent. The Occupy movement thrived from where? From this igniting of like, it's possible to happen, and young people are doing it. I think Africa inspired the whole world to start social movements fighting for their rights, isn't it? So I think being able to travel in Europe, or to travel anywhere, you know, because of education opportunities or economic opportunities, and not being able to migrate within the continent is also something we need to consider. How are we gonna you know, bridge these different regions that we talk about them as regional integrations, but how are we going to bridge these regions is also important. And I think if we want, you emphasize on creating platforms like this. If we want to create platforms like this, we need to have free movement to be able to meet and to create platforms like this. So I think the bureaucracy behind the free movement needs to be really discussed. Ghana is leading now with lifting all the visa restriction for all African nationals. And just saying that we restrict visa for all African nationals, you know, it's something important, you know. It's something important that we cannot be just in this region and not being able to have free movement, and only because you're East, okay, you can go to several countries, you're West. We need to learn from each other, and we need to exchange, and we need to meet to be able to organize, to be able to strategize, to be able to break all the stereotypes, to be able to talk about our identities, to be able to see all the shades of Africans all around the continents, you know, and not just be in our bubble and know history from books that we don't know who put that books, you know, in the education system. So to me personally, it's a very important free movement, because one of my missions is to bridge North Africa with the south of the Sahara, and that would not be possible with restricting, you know, all the visas around the continent. I think it's important for us to cross this Sahara as it used to be before putting these borders, and to be able to move, to trade, to have investment, and not only because if we talk about security and terrorism, they are able to move anyway, without putting those borders. So why you're putting restriction on us who want to go and study, or who want to go and build movements, or who want to go and you know stand with each other for different things, or just exchange, or all these should be lifted. And so those are my top 3 challenges.
With borders as well, we're very silly people sometimes, because we take those borders very seriously. Those are borders that are created with a very nasty colonial history, and we need to take it. We need to relax a little bit, because with conflicts, identities are hardened. You take sides. You're in favor of this, against that, and then you build borders, and then when you have them, you tend to be against and, you know, in favor of this and that. That makes you very rigid in your ways, and not to embrace other cultures. You tend to obsess over what you know, what you were told to love and admire. but you were told not to cross over and to stay here. And we just need to look at our history and say, well, this is not our creation.
I thought you were a nationalist.
I told you.
Nationalists are seeing borders like bridges. So
I told you I'm a nationalist. My
just using you.
Africanness comes from loving my nationality, loving my identity. But I feel very weird about borders around me and conflicts around my region in particular. I wish that there were some conflicts that were not... I'm not happy about the conflicts, for example. I'm not happy about identification of groups and how through time and through history that those groups tend to, be on the opposite side of things. And I wish people were coming together for that. And it doesn't take away from my nationality. It just takes it's in embracing your nationality and loving what your region is all about, and then you start loving your continent. But otherwise, I don't think it works the opposite way for me personally.
For me, I think it works the opposite way, because right now we are facing all the same challenges. Africa or Senegal is not facing whatever it is facing alone. When we talk about the global south. It's not even only Africa now. It's the whole south that is put in the same under the same category. So I think we need to maybe think beyond
transnational.
Yes,
we need to think transnational and
transnational.
organize transnational.
Yeah. Even if we need to think also local, but organize transnationally.
I'm very pro-local.
To conclude, what would be the three main things you are the proud about, whether it's from your own country or from the continent?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm happy about the economic progress. Some countries, like specifically some countries, are showing really well, or doing really well. But in general, it's an inspiration for the rest of the continent, I guess, because economically now young people are part of it. They're not there here just to observe. They're more active. They want to do things their own way. They're very innovative. And I was really surprised to see so many businesses thriving and doing really well and doing it their own way and not having to be guided by other external forces. And that is a really, really proud thing that we need to recognize. And in general, I'm also seeing a little bit of social media and, well, she knows better. I'm not on Twitter. I don't know why. But I think social media is really giving us a good image as well. Because like we've talked about earlier, we need to see that there are so many good things about our continent, so many good things that we need to recognize, and other people should see that as well. And here in SOAS, we get all kinds of questions about being an African. I've never associated myself as an African, for example. That was not an identity for me. So everyone would run to me and ask me about how Senegal, how is Ghana. That was not my intention when I was coming here. I thought I was part of the world and equally embraced like other people were. But and becoming that focal point of when
you're the Africa expert.
I am the African expert now. But isn't it funny, the other way doesn't really work around. You can't be a UK expert, even though you know the history very well. It doesn't really matter if you have a degree or a PhD. The other way is really uncomfortable, but this way it works. So when something about Africa is like, if Africa is part of the course and everyone looks at you and you're like, okay, let's go Senegal. But you don't associate yourself like that. You see it, you love it, you embrace it within the continent, but identities are imposed upon you sometimes. And then you'll be like, okay, so I have a role in trying to change the image of the continent, in trying to change the image of my country. And it is my responsibility, and I'm doing something about it. I'm really grateful to be here, but I want others to have the same opportunity. I'm grateful that countries are opening up their educational systems to let women be part of it, as educators, as also learners in general. I'm very grateful about many things within, the continent in general. And I think if we have a good media to show it, if we have a good platform to really show that side of the continent as well, that would be great. And I don't have to answer so many questions that are so relevant at times.
Just to continue on the social media note. So, in fact, social media was just a medium to socialize, right? Facebook used to socialize. It's until we Africans made social media for social change. So even, these platforms, it's how creative young people can make those work actually for protesting or social change or change the tactic. And since 2011, so like Facebook and Twitter, the main role of these social networks have changed dramatically on how we use them, because of young Africans, utilizing them to organize their movement. So again, something to be proud of is the innovation and boldness of this generation of Africans who are willing to be on the front line, who are willing to sacrifice their lives for other people to enjoy those public goods we were talking about at first. So I think we should not overlook these stories as something like, okay, a revolution happened here, an uprising happened here, and treat those as numbers, people who die every day for fighting for their rights. And I think if you look at these people who, something Kenya did really amazing is that they named every single person who was in Garissa attack. So like we need to tell those stories. We need to be able to say, look, this is what young Africans are doing. They're not sitting back and waiting for jobs. They're actually leading a change. And it's not something we aspire to do. This is what everybody talks about. Okay, let's empower young people to do this and that. We are not waiting to be empowered. We're already leading the change. We're already leading this movement. We're already changing how social media function. We are changing the use of technology and how it works. Like the example of Kenya, how people use M-Pesa for like buying bills and transfer of money and making their life easier, how they have, smoking zones, how they have law for like stepping on the grass, you would be fined for that. So these are things that are not told about African countries, and even that's why I'm focusing a lot on the transnational inside Africa, because in Tunisia, the perceived as, developed north, don't have these high tech that young Kenyans are doing. And Kenyans, when they go on Twitter, they storm. They storm all, they had this campaign, someone tell CNN. They stormed CNN because of a story that came out of violence for Kenya. But these things don't come up on media. What comes on media is, the elections is violent, the conflict is here. But what are young people doing to counter that? What are young people doing to change that? Is it the government who is doing that? It's young people who are doing that, who are, pushing for peace, who are pushing for, to build all these platforms. So we need to support that, and we need to be proud of that, and we need to really document that and look at it as we look at challenges facing Africa. And I think just to end on that, when we talk here about challenges about Africa, it comes from, as you said, the care, but it comes from, we have challenges as any continent in the world to work on. Like, we always want to strive for the best. But that doesn't mean that Africa is depicted here in the West as this miserable place with famine, and all what they remember in Africa is Live Aid and it's
all the bad moments.
Yeah, it's kind of like became labels, but do you remember, what happened here or there? You don't find those stories. And media plays a role in it, but we as Africans also play a role to really push our story to be the mainstream, not the exception.
Exactly, because we're the majority. Do you know that the majority of the world is the South, not the West? And yet every time I think about laws, anything from international law perspective to economical law, anything that works within the world should be recognizing what the South wants, because the South is the majority. If we're not incorporating those truths within the story, then we're not doing anything. Power is really important, and power speaks, and
people power,
exactly. When that power speaks, and it speaks for all of us, and because we don't have it, we're just at the receiving end, nodding our head, and I think we can do much better than that.
So I'm very, very proud African.
And on that, we will end on the proverb, until the lion learns how to tell his own story, the story will be told by the hunter.
Exactly.
So it was great discussing with you.
Thank you.
I learned a lot. It was very inspiring. And I hope we get to have another moment like this.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for accepting the invite.